The woods in southern Alabama do not announce themselves as dangerous. They appear ordinary at first, pines standing like tired witnesses, Spanish moss breathing slowly in the damp air, dirt paths swallowed by leaves. But locals will tell you there is a point where the forest changes, where sound dulls and even insects seem to hesitate. No one remembers who first decided to stop going there. They only remember that people who crossed too far in never spoke the same way again, if they spoke at all. Children were warned without explanation. Hunters turned back without knowing why. And somewhere beyond that invisible line, a family lived for generations without names, without records, and without mercy from nature or God. They were whispered about long before they were ever seen. Shapes between trees. Faces too still. Limbs bent at angles that made the eye recoil before the mind could understand what it was seeing. Some said they were sick. Others said they were cursed. The church called it punishment, though no one could agree on the original sin. Births were rumored but never confirmed. Deaths were assumed but never buried. Time passed, decades folded into each other, and the family remained isolated, inbred, and slowly unraveling into something no longer fully human. The forest hid them well, as if ashamed or complicit. What little evidence remains was not meant to be found. A rotting house swallowed by vines. Rusted tools stained darker than age should allow. Pages of writing that begged forgiveness while demanding obedience. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that this was not just a story of genetic decay, but of belief twisted into survival, of isolation treated as holiness, and of children born already carrying the weight of generations of sin. And even now, when the woods are quiet and the road signs have names, there are those who swear the bloodline never truly ended, that something shaped by that silence still moves between the trees, watching anyone curious enough to listen. The stretch of woodland in southern Alabama that locals avoid has always carried an unspoken weight, as if the trees themselves were aware of the secrets they shield. To the untrained eye, it is merely a quiet forest, the kind that spreads in endless green waves across the countryside, pines standing tall and straight, oaks bending with the weight of age, and moss hanging like forgotten memories from every branch. But those who grew up nearby or have wandered too far along the dirt paths speak of a sensation that cannot be explained, a sudden shift in the air, a heaviness that presses against the chest and makes every breath feel shallow. Animals vanish when humans approach too deep, deer stopping mid-step as though listening to a signal no one else can hear, birds refusing to sing, and the smallest insects pausing their ceaseless motion as if afraid to disturb something sleeping in the shadows. Hunters have reported their compasses spinning wildly, useless in a place where navigation should have been simple, and the sun filtering through the canopy seems muted, as if the light itself hesitates to touch the forest floor. Those who have lingered too long describe an oppressive quiet that is not mere absence of sound, but the sensation that the forest is aware, judging, and waiting. There are tales, passed down in whispers at roadside stores or around backyard fires, of people venturing in for a day and returning hours later with eyes darting nervously, unable to explain why they fled. Some claimed to have glimpsed figures flitting between the trees, humanoid yet disturbingly wrong, with limbs that bent unnaturally or faces that seemed too still to be human. Others told of strange structures, crude cabins, broken fences, and piles of stone arranged in ways that suggested ritual rather than shelter. Older residents recall stories handed down from parents and grandparents, tales that warned children not to wander too far, not to ask questions, and not to linger near certain parts of the woods. It was not fear of animals or wild predators that kept them away, but a sense that something older, something bound to the land itself, watched and judged those who intruded. The forest, they say, has memory. It remembers the sins committed within it, the lives twisted and hidden, and the generations that suffered silently. Even on clear days when the sun is bright and the air is warm, the deeper stretches retain that same oppressive stillness, a pause in the natural rhythm that makes the heart beat faster and the mind imagine horrors lurking just beyond vision. To this day, the path leading into those woods is seldom traveled, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches, as though the forest itself wants to reclaim what was once intruded upon, keeping the secrets of its hidden inhabitants safe from the eyes of the curious. The family at the heart of the forest's dark reputation lived in a manner so removed from the outside world that it became almost impossible to trace their existence through conventional records. They were never seen in town, never registered with the county, and appeared only as fleeting shadows when curiosity or misfortune drew someone close enough to glimpse them through the dense trees. Children born into the family were whispered about but never baptized, adults aged in isolation, and deaths passed unrecorded, leaving only the forest and their own crude structures to bear witness. Generations of this reclusive line seemed to follow their own strange rhythm, unconcerned with the laws, customs, or morality of the outside world. Their isolation was both deliberate and protective, born from a deep fear of contamination, whether moral, spiritual, or genetic, and the family treated the surrounding wilderness as both shield and prison. Outsiders who stumbled upon the edges of their territory often sensed that they were being watched. The occasional glimpse of movement, a figure in the distance, a window shutter creaking in the wind, was enough to drive most intruders away before they could make sense of what they had seen. The family's approach to life, marriage, and child-rearing was similarly opaque, guided by rules that outsiders could not understand and perhaps were never meant to. Every action seemed tied to an unspoken code, a legacy of beliefs passed down through whispered admonitions, ritual, and sometimes fear. Locals who dared to ask questions were met with silence, evasions, or cryptic warnings, and over time, curiosity turned into apprehension. The stories grew into legend, a family so withdrawn that they might as well have been specters, carrying out lives entirely disconnected from the rhythms of the towns and communities around them. Some claimed that the family's appearance changed over the years, each generation bearing subtle, disturbing differences, physical anomalies, odd behaviors, and traits that hinted at generations of inbreeding and unnatural isolation. Yet no one could confirm these accounts, because no one who saw them closely ever returned to speak plainly of the encounter. Despite, or perhaps because of their complete seclusion, the family exerted a peculiar power over the surrounding area. Fear and fascination intertwined, and the woods themselves became synonymous with the family's presence. Travelers told tales of sudden unease when approaching the forest, a sensation of being observed, and animals behaving erratically, all as though the family's influence extended beyond the boundaries of their homestead. Their story was not recorded in newspapers or court files, but in the collective memory of a community shaped by fear, speculation, and occasional, fleeting encounters. Every tale reinforced the idea that this family existed entirely outside the rules of society, a lineage maintained by secrecy and survival in a world that had long since forgotten them, yet one that continued to leave an indelible mark on the imagination of those who lived nearby. The discovery of the old church ledger sent a ripple of unease through the small town, for it was a record that had always seemed ordinary until someone noticed the strange absence within its pages. The ledger, dusty and yellowed with age, chronicled births, marriages, and deaths for decades, each entry meticulously recorded in neat, careful script. Names flowed in sequence, families growing and fading with the steady rhythm of life, until suddenly, without explanation, the entries stopped for one particular surname. At first, it seemed like a simple omission, a clerical error easily dismissed by those who stumbled across it. But closer inspection revealed more than just absence. It was as if the family had been deliberately erased from the records, their existence quietly denied by someone, or something, within the community. What made the ledger even more unsettling were the margins, scrawled with frantic handwriting, the words almost scratching themselves into the paper. Warnings, cryptic and incomplete, spoke of watching eyes and consequences for curiosity, hints that those who sought the family might find more than they bargained for. Researchers, historians, and the occasional thrill-seeker who had access to the ledger could not ignore the feeling that the notes were written in panic or despair, a desperate attempt to preserve knowledge that could not otherwise be trusted to survive. The ledger suggested that the family had been known to the town, had been part of its rhythm for years, but at some point had crossed a boundary invisible to everyone else. There were no explanations, no accounts of crime or scandal, only a void in the record and the sense that the ledger itself was an uneasy witness to something unnatural. The abrupt disappearance of entries coincided with whispers of unusual occurrences in the forest, the kind of stories that were never spoken aloud but lingered in hushed conversations. Hunters and wanderers recalled strange shapes, fleeting glimpses of figures that did not seem fully human, and a sense that the woods were alive with hidden intentions. The combination of absent records and frantic marginalia created a chilling puzzle, a family simultaneously real and unreal, known yet deliberately obscured, leaving no trace except in a ledger that had been intended to chronicle the ordinary. Those who dared to piece together the fragments could sense a pattern of secrecy and fear, of lives lived on the margins of society, and the ledger became a focal point for understanding how deeply the family's isolation and perhaps their deformities had shaped their story. It was a reminder that history could be manipulated not only by those who wrote it, but by those who chose to disappear into shadows, leaving only whispers, broken records, and the faintest traces of their existence behind, and that some truths are kept hidden not by time, but by deliberate, fearful erasure. Over the years, scattered accounts from townsfolk painted a picture of something unnerving lurking at the edge of the forest, a presence both fleeting and undeniable. Witnesses described seeing figures among the trees, shapes that seemed almost human at first glance, but as the eye adjusted, revealed distortions too strange to be natural. Limbs appeared slightly too long or bent in ways that made the mind recoil before the body could register it. Faces, when glimpsed through the filtered sunlight, seemed frozen, almost mask-like, their expressions unreadable yet deeply unsettling, as though the eyes themselves were aware of being watched. Most encounters were brief, an accidental glance while walking the forest path, a shadow moving between the trunks, but they left a lasting impression, the kind that burrows into memory and refuses to be shaken off. Hunters told of hearing faint laughter, the kind that carried through the still air with a hollow resonance, though when they stopped to search, there was never anyone there. Others spoke of rustling leaves and snapped branches that followed them without cause, as if the trees themselves were guiding or warning them, or perhaps echoing the movements of those hidden within. Children, in particular, were attuned to the forest in ways adults could not comprehend, reporting glimpses of figures that vanished when approached, or silhouettes that lingered just beyond the reach of curiosity, their presence both fascinating and terrifying. Even people who considered themselves rational found themselves hesitating near certain clearings, experiencing an inexplicable chill or a sense that eyes were trained upon them, observing and judging every motion. The forest seemed to amplify this sense of surveillance, shadows stretching unnaturally, patterns of light and darkness forming shapes that hinted at figures where none should be. Over time, these accounts coalesced into a pattern, a shared understanding among those familiar with the woods that the family living within was not only real, but extraordinarily adept at remaining unseen while exerting a subtle, oppressive influence over anyone who came near. The stories suggested a combination of human cunning and unnatural adaptation, a way of moving and existing that blurred the line between the familiar and the grotesque. The more people spoke about what they had glimpsed, the more consistent the details became, as if the encounters were not merely coincidences but part of a long-established rhythm, a deliberate interaction with the outside world conducted on the family's terms. Even years later, when investigators and curious outsiders attempted to map the family's presence, these fleeting sightings remained the most reliable evidence of their existence, a haunting reminder that isolation had not rendered them invisible, but rather had transformed them into something both hidden and perceptive, creatures fully attuned to the forest and everyone who dared step too close to its secrets. When the decaying homestead was finally discovered, it revealed a darkness far beyond the whispers and rumors that had surrounded the family for generations. The house itself was swallowed by the forest, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and rot, windows shattered or blackened with grime, and walls scarred with time and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood, mold, and something metallic that clung to the senses and refused to leave. Every corner of the house suggested a life lived under strict and cruel rules, with traces of human presence that were simultaneously intimate and horrifying. Child-sized restraints were scattered throughout the lower rooms, some nailed into the floors or beams as if meant to hold bodies in place, a chilling testament to methods of control and discipline that went far beyond what outsiders could comprehend. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, many smashed or intentionally obscured, hinting at a terror of reflection, as though seeing themselves fully was a danger to those who lived there. Rusted implements of crude surgery or experimentation were arranged haphazardly, stained in ways that suggested long-abandoned practices that had once been conducted with a perverse precision. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper, journals, and even the walls themselves hinted at a family obsessed with sin, purity, and the consequences of defiance, their handwriting trembling at times with fear or rage. Each artifact told a story of children raised in fear, of adults attempting to impose impossible standards, and of generations shaped by isolation and a twisted belief system that justified cruelty as necessity. The floors creaked with every step, as if the house itself mourned the acts committed within, and the faintest breeze stirred papers in a way that made it feel alive, as though the dwelling were aware of the intrusion. Even in decay, the homestead exuded a presence that pressed against the senses, a quiet insistence that the secrets contained within were not meant for outsiders. Investigators and locals who dared enter left shaken, carrying with them the unsettling knowledge that this was more than a simple family home abandoned to time. It was a chamber of rituals and rules, of fear internalized over generations, and a physical manifestation of the family's obsession with control, lineage, and a distorted form of faith. Every item, every mark on the walls, every broken mirror seemed to echo the hidden horrors of the family's existence, a silent record of deformities, both genetic and psychological, that had been nurtured and concealed deep in the forest. In this space, the outside world could not intrude, yet the traces it left behind were stark reminders that isolation had produced something unnatural, a legacy of suffering and obsession preserved in wood, stone, and shadow, waiting to be understood or feared. As investigators pieced together the fragments left behind by the family, a chilling pattern began to emerge, one that pointed to generations of genetic abnormalities born from isolation, inbreeding, and rituals that defied understanding. The more evidence was collected, from skeletal remains to journals, from eyewitness accounts to the fragments of medical tools, the clearer it became that the family's physical differences were not random, but the result of deliberate choices reinforced over decades. Eyes too wide or too small, limbs that bent unnaturally, skin mottled or scarred, and facial features that defied conventional symmetry appeared again and again across generations, each iteration subtly more pronounced than the last. It was a family trapped in a cycle of self-preservation and obsession, using the forest as both sanctuary and laboratory, testing the limits of human endurance and the consequences of isolation. Some of the journals suggested that the family viewed their deformities as proof of destiny or divine judgment, interpreting physical anomalies as signs of favor or punishment from higher powers. Marriages within the family were meticulously arranged to preserve purity, yet over time these unions seemed only to deepen the grotesque traits that had begun to emerge. Beyond the physical, there were patterns in behavior and ritual. The children were trained to react in specific ways to fear, obedience was enforced with unrelenting severity, and the family's understanding of morality and sin became inseparable from their genetic legacy. Outsiders who glimpsed them spoke of movements that seemed unnatural, expressions that unsettled, and voices that carried an echo of something long buried in the forest soil, as though nature itself had been rewritten over generations to reflect the family's internal distortions. Anthropologists and geneticists who later examined the evidence could identify the consequences of prolonged inbreeding, yet even they could not fully explain the extremity of the anomalies, nor the way they seemed amplified by a mix of environment, belief, and ritual. The forest itself had played a role, shielding the family from disease, interference, and contact with the outside world, creating a closed system where their traits could multiply unchecked. It became clear that the family's isolation was not merely social but biological, a deliberate separation that allowed them to cultivate characteristics that would have been impossible in the outside world. In this way, the line between human and something else grew thinner with each generation, a slow distortion of form and function that was mirrored in the psyche of those who survived. Their deformities were more than physical markers, they were a testament to a life unobserved, an existence shaped by fear, devotion, and obsession, and a stark warning of what can happen when human isolation, unchecked belief, and heredity converge into something profoundly unnatural. Buried within the remnants of the family's life, a journal surfaced that revealed the way they understood their own deformities, offering a window into a worldview both tragic and terrifying. The pages, yellowed and brittle, were filled with cramped, uneven handwriting, the words sometimes fading into smudges as if the writer's hand shook under the weight of confession and fear. In it, the family chronicled a belief that their physical differences were not simply accidents of nature, but punishments handed down for ancestral sins long forgotten by the outside world. Each malformed limb, each strange curve of a spine, and every asymmetrical feature was interpreted as a mark of guilt, a living proof of misdeeds committed generations before, sins that could not be erased by confession or repentance. At the same time, the journal revealed that these anomalies were also considered a sign of selection, evidence that the family had been chosen to endure suffering that others could not, to carry the weight of shame and isolation as a form of penance. The text moved between despair and reverence, reflecting the way the family's understanding of divinity and morality had become inseparable from the grotesque reality of their bodies. Children were taught from an early age that their deformities were sacred, a burden to be borne with obedience, and that any attempt to resist or hide them would invoke further misfortune. The author wrote of rituals designed to honor their curse, ceremonies that marked each stage of growth, each injury or illness, and even the loss of life, all framed as necessary steps in a cycle of divine observation. The more the journal was read, the clearer it became that the family's sense of identity was built entirely around suffering and endurance. There was no concept of beauty, health, or normalcy as outsiders might understand it. The pages also hinted at a deeper fear that should their story be exposed or violated by strangers, the punishment would extend beyond themselves, infecting the forest and those who dared trespass. Odd sketches accompanied the text, crude diagrams of anatomy distorted by imagination or observation, accompanied by symbols that seemed to track heredity, morality, and sin simultaneously. Each entry reinforced a worldview where deformity and divinity were bound together, where the horrors of isolation were sanctified, and where survival demanded both acceptance and fear. Even as modern readers pieced together the genetic and psychological consequences of these beliefs, the journal conveyed the intensity of the family's conviction, a belief so deeply rooted that it transformed their existence into something simultaneously human and otherworldly. Through these pages, the family's deformities were not merely physical, they were evidence, instruction, and warning, a testament to generations who had learned to see their own suffering as proof of both punishment and purpose, and who had allowed it to define every aspect of their lives within the forest's shadow. Local authorities had once attempted to intervene in the mysteries surrounding the family, drawn by reports of strange sightings, disappearances, and the growing unease of townspeople who had long whispered about the forest's hidden occupants. At first, the effort seemed straightforward. A few officers, accompanied by search parties, ventured into the dense woodland with maps, flashlights, and a determination to uncover what had been hidden for generations. They expected to find an abandoned homestead, perhaps some signs of neglect, or at worst, a family living in extreme isolation. What they encountered, however, defied every expectation. From the moment they crossed the threshold into the deeper parts of the woods, a palpable tension hung in the air, pressing against their senses, muting sound and warping perception. Paths that had been mapped carefully disappeared into impenetrable undergrowth, compasses spun uselessly, and the very rhythm of time seemed altered, as though the forest itself rejected the presence of outsiders. As they pressed further, glimpses of figures flitting between the trees heightened anxiety, shadows that moved with intelligence rather than randomness, observing silently without revealing themselves. Officers reported hearing voices, sometimes human, sometimes a distorted echo, always just out of reach, never forming coherent words, but enough to make hearts race and instincts scream to turn back. The homestead, when finally located, appeared both abandoned and eerily inhabited. Doors creaked open without touch, furniture was displaced as if by unseen hands, and items once ordinary were twisted into arrangements suggesting ritual or warning. Some members of the search party claimed to feel watched, followed, even manipulated by forces they could not identify, and a creeping paranoia began to settle over the group. As hours turned into days, morale collapsed. Seasoned officers found themselves questioning what was real, seeing shapes in the shadows that could not exist, hearing footsteps behind them where no one stood. One by one, they withdrew, returning to town shaken and often silent, refusing to elaborate on what they had seen or felt, speaking only in fragments and half-formed warnings to those who asked. The official records, if any were kept, were minimal, with reports citing inconclusive findings or attributing fear to natural obstacles in the terrain. The true experiences of the officers, however, lingered in hushed conversations, in the haunted expressions of men who had ventured too far and been forced to acknowledge that the family's presence was something beyond normal comprehension. The failed intervention underscored the difficulty of confronting a lineage that had lived for generations in calculated isolation, shaping not only their own deformities and behaviors but also the forest around them into a barrier of protection and intimidation. It became clear that any attempt to penetrate their world was not merely a matter of tracking or investigation, but a confrontation with a force molded by decades of secrecy, belief, and survival, and that those who entered rarely emerged unchanged, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that some things were never meant to be disturbed. The final generation of the family vanished without a trace, leaving behind only fragments of their existence, unsettling evidence, and the lingering fear that something once human had been transformed into something far more unknowable. Their homestead, already crumbling under the weight of years and neglect, became a hollow monument to lives carefully hidden from the world, with broken furniture, shattered mirrors, and discarded tools scattered across the rooms like a testament to rituals and rules that no outsider could fully grasp. Skeletal remains were discovered in shallow graves, some malformed in ways that echoed centuries of inbreeding and isolation, while others were disturbingly absent, leaving only impressions in the soil as if bodies had been lifted or erased by forces no investigator could explain. The forest, long a protective barrier, seemed to reclaim everything the family had touched, overgrowing paths, swallowing debris, and creating a sense that the land itself remembered their presence and intended to keep it secret. Witnesses who ventured near reported glimpses of movement between the trees, fleeting shadows that hinted at figures watching, retreating just as quickly, as though aware of scrutiny yet refusing to be fully seen. The journal entries, notes, and artifacts left behind suggested that the family had prepared for disappearance, perhaps understanding the inevitability of their extinction or the danger of exposure, yet also hinting at a belief in continuity beyond the physical, an idea that the bloodline's essence, however deformed or corrupted, could endure in the woods themselves. Locals told stories of encounters in the months following their disappearance, a strange shape on the horizon, footprints that appeared and vanished, or the echo of voices too faint and distorted to recognize. Each of these signs reinforced the notion that the forest had become a living extension of the family, a place where the boundaries between human, animal, and something far stranger were blurred. Anthropologists and historians examining the site could account for much of what remained in terms of genetics, architecture, and folklore, yet there were elements that defied rational explanation: traces of elaborate ritual, patterns in the arrangement of remains, and evidence of behavior that suggested intelligence beyond mere survival. The family's disappearance did not erase their influence, it transformed the forest into a silent observer, a repository for secrets and deformities cultivated over centuries. Even today, anyone who ventures too far into the woods senses a presence, a watchfulness that cannot be explained, as though descendants of that bloodline, twisted, hidden, and shaped by isolation, still move among the trees. The idea that they are gone entirely feels impossible, because the forest seems alive with memory, as if the family's essence has merged with the land itself, leaving a lingering dread and the certainty that the bloodline, in some form, continues to endure, waiting, unseen, for anyone curious enough to seek it out. Even decades after the last known members of the family disappeared, evidence suggested that the bloodline had not been completely extinguished, and that the woods of southern Alabama still harbored something shaped by isolation, secrecy, and a distorted sense of purpose. Investigators and locals alike reported fleeting signs that could not be ignored, footprints that appeared where none should have been, faint cries or laughter carried on the wind that vanished when approached, and shadows that moved with a deliberate intelligence, always just beyond clear sight. Researchers studying the homestead and surrounding forest uncovered items suggesting that descendants had continued to survive in secrecy: makeshift shelters, rudimentary tools, and remnants of clothing that did not belong to any known visitor or trespasser. Genetic material recovered from the site, though fragmentary, hinted at the survival of traits cultivated over generations of isolation, deformities, and anomalies passed down intentionally or by circumstance, creating individuals who were both human and unmistakably shaped by their environment and ancestry. Folklore among townspeople continued to grow, stories of glimpsed figures in the forest or strange sounds in the night that could not be explained by natural causes, reinforcing the idea that the family had not vanished entirely but had merely adapted to remain unseen. Even the forest itself seemed complicit, thickening in certain areas, paths closing, and undergrowth twisting in ways that guided or deterred those who wandered too close. Some theorized that the remaining descendants had learned to move almost symbiotically with the woods, existing in a state of extreme vigilance and secrecy, observing outsiders while remaining hidden, preserving the family's legacy and deformities while avoiding contact. The combination of folklore, physical evidence, and unexplained phenomena created a chilling conclusion. The bloodline, while invisible, was still very much present, a living continuation of centuries of secrecy and distorted belief. Scientists and historians approached the idea with caution, unable to reconcile the genetic and environmental data with the consistent eyewitness reports and the unbroken string of anomalies in the forest. Those who dared to enter the deeper woods often returned changed, more fearful, more aware of unseen observation, and more hesitant to speak, implying that the family's influence extended beyond physical presence, leaving psychological traces that reinforced their survival. Even modern investigations, equipped with cameras, drones, and tracking technology, struggled to detect the descendants, as though they had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, using knowledge passed down through generations to manipulate perception and protect themselves from discovery. The evidence pointed toward a bloodline that had evolved alongside the forest, shaped by isolation, belief, and perhaps a desire to endure, leaving a lingering sense that the family had not simply disappeared, but had transformed into something that defied ordinary understanding. The woods remained a silent guardian of their secrets, a living testament to a line of people created and sustained by isolation, ritual, and survival, suggesting that even today, if one were to walk carefully and watch the shadows, the descendants of that cursed family might still be there, waiting, hidden, and watching every step.